I'd like to have you turn in your Bibles back to Genesis chapter 8. We're going to be looking at Genesis 8 and 9 today. We're still talking a little bit about Noah here and what happened with the flood and all. And in fact, there was a movie here recently about Noah. Hopefully you did not go and see it. I was all excited to go to this movie because I thought, okay, and who's the guy there? Russell Crowe. You know, he's a really good actor, and he was playing Noah. And so I was really excited to see this. Then I started reading some reviews about it, and the reviews were like, if you expect this to be the story of Noah in the Bible, you are going to be disappointed because it was a little different. But finally, curiosity got the best of me. We did go see it. And sure enough, it's not anything like the Bible. The only thing that resembles the Bible story is, yes, there is a guy named Noah, and he has 3 sons and a wife, and yes, he builds a boat, and there is a flood. And that's about where it ends right there. The whole rest of the story is not worth seeing. But anyway, we want to talk about Noah today and set the record straight. Now, and when we get to Genesis chapter 8 here, the flood is already over, and God makes a new covenant with Noah. And theologians call this the Noetic covenant. If you ever hear those words, you'll know what it is, the Noetic covenant. But it's just really an agreement with Noah. And it's sort of a new deal that God is making with Noah, because he already made a deal with Adam and Eve. Remember that? And so now he's going to change the rules a little bit, because things have changed. And it's sort of like what we're going through right now. You know, every once in a while the government changes the rules. Did you notice that? We're going through a deal right now that a lot of people call it Obamacare. And some people, I guess the official name is, what is the official name? It's the Affordable Health Care. Affordable Health Care Act. So anyway, and it's changing the rules about how health care gets administrated here in our country. And so it's got mixed reviews. Some people love it, some people hate it. But it doesn't matter. It's the rule, it's the law of the land now. And so we're going through this change in our country. And so God was making a change with Noah, and it's a new covenant, it's a new agreement, it's a new contract, you might say. And so that's what we see here in Genesis chapter 8. And so the question today is, what did change? What's different now with the Noah's covenant? And the first thing is that God changed his approach to man. And look with me at Genesis 8:21. And the Lord smelled the smoothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. So it's as if the Lord gets a new revelation here. And he says, you know what? I've observed man, and you know what I come up with? Man's intent is evil, even from his youth. And this seems to be sort of a new revelation to even God himself. We're going to talk about that here a little bit later. And now, why would he say that? Why would he all of a sudden come up with this new observation? And because back in Genesis 6, you remember when we studied that, we said that the earth was very violent. Now, one of the things that the movie Noah, if you did see it, it did kind of portray that people were violent. And not only violent man against mankind, but also against the animal kingdom. And you might even wonder, well, why did Noah have to build this ark and save all the animals? It could have been that the animals were going to be killed off by man if God didn't save them miraculously. That could have been what was going on there. But in Genesis 6, 5, 11, and 12, it says, Then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Imagine that. Every thought was only evil continually. That's a lot of evil. I think it's more than we can even possibly imagine how evil, how violent, how destructive the society during Moses' time, or Noah, I always get Moses and Noah mixed up. But anyway, Noah, during his time, it was so violent that the only way God was going to save the human race was to wipe out the violence and just save Noah, who was the only one that was righteous, and his family. It goes on to say, now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. So it was so violent that God said he was sorry that he had made man. You can imagine that. God was really sorry. It's in Genesis 6:6 it says, and the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So imagine that. God was sorry. I mean, God almost saying, well, wow, I didn't really see this coming. And you say, well, how can that be? How could God have been surprised by evil? Because he's God. He's supposed to know it. You know, God is everywhere. He's omnipresent. He's omniscient, means he knows everything. He's omnipotent, means he's all-powerful. Well, he's omniscient. Shouldn't he have known that this was coming? But think about God. In fact, Glenn was sharing that God is light. And there's a verse in 1 John 1:5 that says, God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. So it's hard for us to conceive of that because we have darkness in us. We're sinners. We know what evil is like. God is light. There's no darkness in him at all. So evil is a strange thing. It's not something he's acquainted with. Romans 16:19 says, be wise in what is good and innocent in what is evil. And we are made in God's image. God made us just the way he is. And that's the way he is. He's wise in what is good, but he's innocent when it comes to evil. And so think about this. This was new uncharted territory, I believe, for God. When he saw how evil played its part out, how violent people became. Remember Cain. Cain rose up against his brother and killed his brother Abel. And you think, well, okay, he killed his brother. He deserves to die, right? But in God's economy, in God's kingdom, under the agreement with Adam, there was no death penalty. That part hadn't played out yet. And so Cain was allowed to live. Now God changes that when he comes to Noah. We're going to see that here in a while. That he says, okay, here's a new rule. If somebody kills somebody, then they deserve to die. And that's the way it's going to be. So, and then in 1 Corinthians 14:20, it says, do not be children in your thinking, yet in evil be babes, but in your thinking be mature. So this idea, again, that when it comes to evil, we shouldn't even go there. It shouldn't be a place where we go because the Lord himself does not go there. His thinking is pure, it's holy, it's righteous, and we are to be like him. And so when evil played out in Noah's day, it was like God was observing, wow, I couldn't imagine that it became this bad as it did. And so I'm sorry that I even made mankind. Now, there are certain events in our life that we remember those days. In fact, when I was a little kid, I was looking through my mom's, she had a family album. And there was one picture in there that stood out to me because it was a picture of my mom when she was a teenager. It was a black and white photo. And my mom grew up in a farm between here and Corvallis. And there she was with her family, her mom and dad, her sisters and her brother. And there was a picture taken of them and no one was smiling. And there was a date at the bottom of the picture. And I said, when I was a little kid, I said, Mom, how come no one is smiling in this picture? And she says, well, look at the date. And so I looked at the date. And it said December 7th, 1941. And I said, what's December 7th, 1941? She says, well, that was when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And she said it was on a Sunday, and we came home after church, and we didn't know what else to do, so we just took a picture of ourselves. Because we knew that was a day that was going to change the world. And there are days like that, aren't there, where all of a sudden it's a game changer. The world is not going to be the same after this happened. And I remember when I was about 12 years old, on November 22nd, 1963. You probably, those that were alive, you all remember where you were. It was the day that it was announced that President Kennedy had been shot and killed. That changed the world. It changed the way we think about presidents and their safety, and the fact that a president could be assassinated right here under our own nose. And so there were all kinds of measures that got changed with the Secret Service and how presidents present themselves in public. Everything changed because of that day. It was almost as if the bar had been raised when it comes to evil. And then we all remember September 11th, 2001. Remember waking up to the news or hearing the news that the towers in New York. Who could have conceived that a passenger jet plane could be used as a bomb to bring down two of the biggest buildings in the world? I don't think many people had even conceived of that, and then it happened. And so the bar was raised, a new era of evil. And now we have the Department of Homeland Security, and things have changed. It's different now, isn't it? It's all different, and that's what was happening in Noah's day, is that the Lord had said, wait a minute, this thing has gotten clear out of hand. We've got to change the rules. We've got to change the covenant with mankind, and that's what God was doing. God is making man accountable now for his sin and the consequences. We're accountable for the consequences of sin. And he went so far as to install the death penalty. Genesis 9, 5, and 6. Just read it there. It says, and surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it. In other words, if an animal were to kill a person, the animal would have to die. That's in the Old Testament law, actually. And from every man's brother, I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man, and there it is. So God was installing, he's making us accountable now for our actions, for our sin. There are consequences. And, when you're raising kids, some of you have already raised your kids. They're gone. And your chances is gone. But now you've got grandkids. But those of you that are still raising kids, I know Tony and Amber, you're just starting out here. You've got two little ones. And when we're raising our kids, we need to keep our kids accountable for what they do. And you say, well, how do you do that, I know when our kids were little, we had one child, and that was fine. But things change when you have two. And along came the second one, and we found that the older one kind of picked on the younger one. The older one wasn't as excited about that younger one as we were. Here was a rival all of a sudden. And so the younger one finally got to the age where he could fight back a little bit, and he had some teeth coming in. And you know the story, how it goes. All of a sudden, one day, the younger one figures out, hey, I can use those teeth. And so he bites the older brother. And older brother is just up in arms. He bit me, and what are you going to do? And so we went to the younger one, and we talked to him. We said, now, don't bite John. He doesn't like that. Hurts John, and you don't want to do that. It makes him cry. You think that stopped him? No. Every time he got a chance, he would bite his brother. And he really didn't know what to do. And finally, Ann said one day, she took his little arm and she gave him a little bite. And he looked at her like, that hurts. And all of a sudden, something clicked in his mind. That the consequences of what he was doing, and that's what God was doing here. He said, if you shed man's blood, then your blood's going to get shed. There's an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, is what the Old Testament law was all about. And this was the beginning of it here. God was making us accountable. God is teaching us the principle of accountability. Now, remember when Cain killed his brother, and God came to him and confronted him, and he said, where's your brother? And Cain said, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? And we've pondered that question. Are we really our brother's keeper? Well, this changed everything, because now It says we are our brother's keeper. There in verse 5 it says, and from every man's brother I will require the life of man. In other words, there's an accountability that we have towards each other to help keep each other in line. It goes beyond capital punishment. You know, that's the ultimate punishment. But hey, what if we could back it up and be accountable before that? You know, wouldn't that be a good idea? And that's what the Lord is presenting here. Because the Lord knows and understands that we have a sin nature. That's what he was observing there. He says, I've seen that man, his intent is evil from his youth. In other words, we are born with this innate tendency to default into sin. Any of you that have had children, you know this. It happens at a young age. The kids, they're not perfect. You know, they cry, they whine, they're self-centered. It's all about me. And then they get old enough to play with a toy, and here's little child number 1 playing with a toy, and here's little child number 2, and they're playing with a toy. And everything is fine until little child number 2 sees that little child number 1 is playing with a toy. He wants that toy. That's mine. And he leaves his toy, and they fight over that one. But why? Because we have this innate desire, this defaulting into sin. We're selfish at the root. We're prideful, we're defensive, we're combative, and we're kind of lazy. You know, if someone's not watching, we can fall into a tendency of laziness. Now, I think I've shared before that I do one of my jobs. I do about 4 hours a day. I work for Sprint telephones, and I do customer service. I do it right from my home, and so constantly I'm answering calls. And people are complaining about their phone, or they're late paying their bill, and so you know they have all these questions, and they train us how to answer these questions, and they give us certain phrases to say, and when to say them, and even how to ask them how their day is going. You know, try to build a rapport. There's all this psychology that's going on, and they call these things metrics. And they'll listen to our phone calls with us, and they'll say, okay, you forgot to find out what their last name was, or you forgot to verify their phone number, or you forgot to tell them, well, thank you for being a valued Sprint customer. You know, and all these little phrases that you're supposed to do, and you got to do it within like 4 or 5 minutes, or you know, the call is too long. So all these things going on. And here's the deal: that Sprint, now they got all kinds of money, and they've done all kinds of studies. And they figured out that if they just leave guys like me and gals, if they just leave us on our own, we don't say all those little things we're supposed to say. And so what they devised is that we have a supervisor. And there's a person, and that all their job is to make sure that we do our job. You know, they pay a person. That person is not productive at all as far as answering calls. But they're there to keep us in line. And so I meet with my supervisor once a week for a half an hour on a phone call. And every week it's the same questions. You know, are you showing up for work? Are you being late on your breaks? Are you going through all these metrics? Are you saying the right things? Let's listen to a call. Do you have any questions? And a half hour fills up real fast. And it's just to keep me on pace, keep me on task, because as I'm answering those calls, you know what's going on in the back of my head? I got to meet with that supervisor this week, and they might review this call. So I got to be real sure that I hit all these little numbers that I got in. And that's going on in the back of my mind. It's sort of a whip, you know. It's being accountable is what it is. And that's a principle that we need to, if we're going to have successful children, then we need to keep them accountable. Okay, did you take out the garbage? Did you make your bed? Did you clean your room? Did you do your homework? You know, we said we weren't going to watch that TV show, right? And it doesn't have to be out of anger. It can be done in love. And my supervisor, he doesn't yell at me. He doesn't raise his voice with me. He just goes over the things that I'm supposed to do. And if I'm not doing, he's, well, what's wrong here? How can we make this better? And set goals. And, you know, it's kind of a painless thing, but it's not the most pleasant thing. But no one loses their temper. No one gets out of line. It's a pleasant experience, and we can do this with our kids and business people. This is something we have to do with our employees, because we just have this natural tendency that the Lord revealed to us here with Noah, that we can become lazy if we're not careful. And also businesses with our customers. Our customers keep us accountable. You know, if you're in business and you've got customers, you got to keep them happy or they're going to go somewhere else. And so everyone is accountable, no matter what your position in life. In fact, remember the story when Jesus was healing, and a centurion came to Jesus, and he said, Jesus, my son is sick. Would you come and heal? And Jesus says, well, sure, I'll go to your house and we'll heal. And then the centurion got a great insight. Now, the centurion, he was a high mucky-muck in the Roman army, in the Roman military. He had a centurion, he had 100 people that were under him. But when he came to Jesus, he says, I too am a man under authority. He didn't say, Jesus, I'm a man in authority just like you. He says, I'm a man under authority. In other words, he understood this concept of accountability. He had to be accountable to his boss. And he said, and I have people under me, and he says, and I say to them, go, and they go, and I say, come, and they come. And so he said, Jesus, all you need to do is just speak the word, and my son will be healed. And Jesus says, wow, I have not seen so great a faith in all Israel. Now, the centurion was not an Israelite. He was a Roman. And yet he had more faith because he understood this principle of accountability. He understood the principle of authority and how things work. And if things are going to get done, if people are going to be successful, there's this idea of accountability. And we all need to take advantage of that and be aware of it and put it into practice. Now, what happens when a person is not under authority? That's when we get in trouble. When we either take ourselves out from under authority, or for some reason we've risen to a level where we feel like we don't have authority or accountability, that's when we get in trouble. Now, a few years ago, there was a guy named Bernie Madoff. And he made off with a bunch of money because he was at the top. He was at the top of his company. He had an investment company. And somehow he cooked the books. And he was able, there was nobody watching. Nobody who was accountable to anyone. And so he just started making up numbers. And even though people were losing money, on paper it showed that they were making money. And this went on for years until finally the whole thing came tumbling down. And you know the story. But he got himself in trouble because he wasn't accountable. So this is one thing that has changed here with the Lord and with God. And this agreement with Moses is this idea that there needs to be accountability. Now, the other thing that changed that we're going to talk about today, just briefly, is that this was the beginning of seasons. Now, look at what it says there in Genesis 8:22. It says, now while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Now you say, well, what's so new about that? I mean, seed time and harvest, day and night, cold and heat, summer and winter. Wasn't it always like that? No, it wasn't always like that. Because what was going on with creation, if you read closely in Genesis chapter 1 where it's telling about the 7 or the 6 days of creation, there's a verse there in verses 6 to 7 that says there was this thing called an expanse or a firmament. It's how the King James Version describes it. And the expanse, it says there was waters above and there were waters below. In other words, there were waters on the earth, and then there was a different group of waters that were above. And some scientists believe that there was a canopy of vapor or a water or a huge cloud that enveloped the earth so that it created like a terrarium effect. That the whole earth was a tropical climate. Even the North Pole and the South Pole were a warm tropical climate. And you say, wow, that's weird. Is there any evidence for that? And the fact is there is, because geologists are now discovering, and have discovered over the years, that there are plant life like palm trees they've discovered north of Siberia and in Siberia itself. And on the North and South Pole, there have been discoveries of wildlife that flourished at one time. I've got an article here, I forgot to bring it up with me, but it describes some of these discoveries that they found. You know where Prudhoe Bay is? It's in the north part of Alaska where they're drilling for oil. It started back in the 80s, I believe. And they, in their drilling, they found all kinds of these evidence of wildlife and plant life that there's no way it could have survived under the present climate. There had to be a tropical climate at one time. And so, sure enough, that's what was happening. And when the flood began, it says that the floodgates of the sky were opened in Genesis 7:11. The floodgates of the sky. So this water canopy or vapor or whatever it was, it emptied, it dumped onto the earth. And after the flood, it was gone. And so now we have seasons. We have summer, we have winter, we have cold, we have heat. That's different than what it was. And what it says to us is that there are now cycles of life that we need to be aware of. There are seasons. There's a time to plant. There's a time to harvest. Now, before the flood, you could plant any old time. You could harvest later. It didn't matter when you planted. Now it does matter. We're at that time of year right now where the farmers are beginning to plant their crops. This is the time. If you miss this window and don't plant right now, there's going to be serious consequences. You won't have a crop later on when it comes time to harvest. Now later on, in July and August, September, that's when the harvest comes. You got to plant first and then you get your harvest. And so there are these cycles. Now, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it says, to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. You've probably heard those words before because Pete Seeger, a folk songwriter, took those very words and made a song out of it and called it Turn, Turn, Turn. And the Byrds made that song famous, and anybody that's lived through that time period, that was one of the popular songs of the day. It says there's a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. That means there's a time to plant, there's a time to harvest, among other things. Now, in Galatians 6, 7-9, this is an important verse that really brings out this idea of seed time and harvest, planting and reaping, because it says, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows or plants, that will he also reap. And then it goes on to say, for the one who sows to his own flesh shall from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit shall from the Spirit reap eternal life. And then here's the catchy verse in verse 9. It says, let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time, we shall reap if we do not grow weary. So, let us not lose heart in doing good. Because we know, if we stick with it, then in due time, we will reap. And we will reap bountifully. So there's this principle that we have now. We have a seed time and we have a harvest. We have a time to sow. We have a time to reap. And parents, again, there we have a promise in Proverbs that says, train up a child in the way he should go. And when he is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, it says, when he is old, he will not depart from it. So as a parent, I know there were times when we got frustrated a bit because we were trying to teach our kids these principles, but they didn't seem to be getting them. They kept making the same mistakes over and over, and we'd go over it with them again. We tried to keep them accountable. We went to great means to keep them accountable. Even at one point, Anne was recording phone calls of our daughter, if you can believe it or not. Unbeknownst to her. This was back in the day when you could do that with the technology. It was before cell phones, thank goodness. I get down on my knees every day and thank God there were no cell phones when my daughter was in high school. But that's not true now. So there's new ways of keeping your children accountable. But the promise is, if we train up our children in the way they should go, that when they are old, they will not depart from it. And so we need to not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we shall reap the harvest. Now, that's true in prayer as well. In our prayer life, you know, we, like today, you know, Ron, is Ron still with us? Okay. Yep, he's there. All right. And we prayed for Ron, and praise God, the prayer was answered, wasn't it? Immediately. Ron's fine. He's hiding over there in the corner, but he's fine. And so, you know, sometimes we get the idea that we should get an instant answer to prayer. Because we pray for these healings and then they just take place right away. But sometimes, many times, the answer doesn't come right away. The answer doesn't come in 2 or 3 days, or 3 or 4 weeks, or 4 or 5 months. The answer may take years. And we are to be persistent in prayer. We are to be, it's like sowing a seed, you know. And if you go out and plant your daffodils, you know, that's not a seed, that's a bulb. That's probably not a good idea. But we did plant some daffodils this year, and they just weren't coming up. And everybody else had their daffodils. They were up, but ours weren't. They weren't doing anything. And I was tempted to go dig those things up and see what was going on. But if I'd have done that, guess what? They would never have come up. Because you got to leave the seed in the ground if it's going to sprout. And sure enough, after a while, in due time, those daffodils came up. 4 of them. The others haven't come up yet. Maybe next year. But you see, we stay persistent. We keep believing. We keep on praying. And then we have the promise that in due time, we will reap the harvest. Now, maybe you're here today and you've never received Christ as your Lord. I would imagine that someone has been praying for you. And that they've been praying maybe not just a short time, but for a long time. And maybe today's the day where you say, you know what, I want to receive Jesus as my Lord and Savior. If that's true, you can do that right in your seat. You can just say, Lord, I thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ, that He died for me, that He took my place. He took my sin. I ask Him into my heart. And we encourage you to do that. Let's sing our closing chorus now. Let's stand and do that.